So in my last video I had attempted to repair a broken piezo element on one of my saddles here, and I was unsuccessful. I have not been able to find anything that really works. At the end of that video I had mentioned that I knew someone that used to work with Ken Parker at Parker back in the early days, and he was going to send me some saddles, which he did. He made good on his promise, and he sent me a couple of these original Parker Fly saddles, which I then proceeded to change out. So the replacement one is this one right here. You can see it looks just very slightly different to the rest of them, but it makes me very happy that I was able to actually find one of these things. I mean, these things are ridiculously hard to find. If you find one, you're probably going to pay well over $100 for it. I've been looking on eBay off and on for a couple years. Have not found any of this particular kind of saddle. So the big deal about this is that if you can't find one of these original saddles, you're stuck with having to use a second or third generation Parker saddle, which is probably not going to have the same output as these original ones. The impedance, you're probably going to have impedance issues. You might have one of these being really noisy, etc. So your other choice would be to get a new set of Graphtec Ghost saddles, which are all black. So I mean, it changes the look of the guitar. Not the total end of the world, but I happen to think these saddles are really cool, and it would just always would bother me if that's what I had to do. Now, why is it a big deal? Because as I understand it, if you replace these original saddles with Ghost saddles, they're probably going to be way hotter output than these original ones are. You're going to probably have noise issues. It might be too hot a signal for the original electronics inside the guitar on this PCB back here behind these controls, which means that then you either have to change out the electronics to, depending on the generation of saddles you're talking about, of course, to either the Fishman power chip, if you're using the second generation dog bone style piezo saddles, or if you go with the Ghost system, you have to put in a circuit board just for that, which means you have to tear out all the electronics in here. So you're ditching the original electronics, which you're probably at this point still saying, well, what's the big deal? Well, the problem with that is that if you have to do that, you end up losing your master volume control and your tone control on your piezo pickups. So essentially be turning your refined fly into a refined fly, or in other words, a watered down fly. So you would have basically one control that would just be a dummy, which is kind of what I have now, because I changed this to a push-pull pot just so I could get coil tapping on these pickups. But the other thing that really sucks is the tone control on the piezo. I mean, yeah, you could live without it, but it's really nice to have that tone control on the piezo. So that is the big issue with having to replace saddles on these Parker Flies. It could be a real problem. So next I'm just going to show you that even on the original Parker Fly saddles, there was some variations in the design of these. So I'll show you that next. So on the left here is the saddle that came off my guitar, made in 1995. On the right is the replacement sent to me that I received a couple weeks ago. Now, they look more or less the same, but you can see that so-called ball bearing, or BB, or whatever you want to call it, looks just a little bit different. It's a little shinier, it's a little smaller, but essentially they're the same thing. But what's interesting is apparently these went through some design iterations, and you can see how they look different on the back side. Now, as far as I know, these should have about the same output. I don't really notice a difference in the output between this original one on my guitar and these ones that were sent to me, but it's kind of curious how these are a little bit different. I don't know why there was design iterations. Maybe it was just ease of manufacturing, or trying to find something that had the optimal output, or who knows what. But anyways, as far as I can tell, the outputs of these two things are pretty much the same. It seems like maybe this original saddle here, which I don't know if this is a later or earlier design than this, it seems to have just a tiny bit, perhaps, less output, but if it does, it's so little that I'm actually second guessing myself as to whether it really does have slightly less output or not. So it's kind of that psychoacoustics thing at play there. And so if you are lucky enough to find a saddle to replace the original one on your pre-refined fly, just be aware that they will look different, and don't let that freak you out. Worst case is that, this is what I did, worst case is you could just put this other one on the top E string, and that way if it has slightly less output, that's kind of the loudest, fattest string on the guitar, and if anything, it'll just help your top E string sound less muddy and boomy. So I just thought that was interesting. And the other thing that complicates matters is that, you know, Parker had the original saddle here on their flies, which are kind of referred to as ball bearing or BB type. They had the dog bone type, and then the US Music Corporation had a new type, which was all one piece, which I thought was the best design because there's no separate pieces to come apart on these things. And then of course, when US Music Corp went out of business, the Graphtec Ghost saddles became the only replacement saddle that there is. What makes these piezo saddles particularly difficult to fix is, one, you got to try to find a conductive epoxy, which I have not been able to find. In my previous video I had mentioned that maybe JB Weld would work, but I realized after I put that video out that JB Weld's actually non-conductive as well. So if you can find a conductive epoxy and just stick a little drop of it here and join these two pieces together, you might be able to repair your saddle. The other problem is that if you look in here closely, there is like a copper foil between this piece here that is electrically isolated from the saddle and this piece here that is connected to the piezo crystals that your string sits upon. So if you're lucky enough to find conductive epoxy, you got to use just a tiny bit of it, because if that spills out and makes contact with this outer shell here, this foil, this in the saddle part that's grounded, all you're going to do is just ground out your piezo. So I haven't totally given up on the idea of being able to repair one of these, but I do think that it's probably just not going to happen.